Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to be taking a look at FX Modulator, which was released with Cubase 12. Once you've gone over the basics of audio production, so you understand what effects you want to use, how to use them and where, the next step generally is to change them over time, and typically that will involve automation. But it's definitely one of those things where it's the graph of distance versus desire. So if it's really easy to do, or if you really, really want to do it, you'll make that effort. But when things fall in between there, and maybe it's something that you kind of want to do, but it's a lot of effort, often those things just fall by the wayside and you don't bother doing them. There's been a few effects over the years which have attempted to reduce the difficulty gap, if it were. One of them which springs to mind is the original free version of D-Blues Glitch, which was a fantastic plugin which allowed you to control and chain effects, sequence them and change their parameters really, really easily. It was a really, really great effect. For me, the second version didn't capture that anywhere near as well, and I just quit using it at that point, particularly because now it's an old 32-bit Windows only plugin and I'm not even sure you can get it anymore. Another one like that was iZotope's Stutter Edit, which, while it's not the same kind of thing because it offers maybe fewer effects in the first version at least, but it meant it was playable because you can just route a MIDI keyboard to it and change the sound or the effect that you're using really easily. Steinberg's FX Modulator kind of falls between these. So it's got a number of effects that you can chain. I think you can chain up to 6 of them, and you can modulate 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 parameters of each effect really, really easily. So it's bringing down the amount of difficulty to getting these kind of effects. And because it's got a series of useful presets on there, it makes it easier to find something to modify rather than having to start from scratch, which would be the case if you were just loading all this up from scratch with effects you've just got on your DAW. But the question is, does it work? The devil is always in the details, so let's take a look at them now. So here we are in Cubase, and as you can see, I've inserted an FX modulator already, and we'll just open it up. And here's the plugin as it appears with nothing running in it. It doesn't quite fit in the screen capture size I'm using, so it's off the bottom of the screen, but we're not losing anything particularly interesting at this point. Now, it's effectively a multi-effect plugin, but it's the modulation which makes it sound interesting, as the name implies. So let's just add a module so we can add in something that we'll actually hear the effect of. So let's just add in a flanger. So I'm just double click that and that's put that in that first module. Okay. And we can see we've got 2 controls here. We've got feedback and mix. And if we play it, we can hear the flangers on. We can bypass that individual one. So that's the dry sound. And then we've got that with that on there. Now, the thing that's interesting about FX Modulator is the fact we can apply modulation, as the name implies. So you can draw in patterns here that you want and then control one of these. So at the moment, our target is going to be frequency. So the frequency of this is what's going to be modulated by this here, and it's highlighted here as well. Now, with some, you get multiple choices, but with this particular one, we just get frequency. So let's just load up a sine wave. So I just click this sine wave, and you can see now that's being modulated. And as we play it back, you can hear we're getting much more of a sweep on that flanger. Now, we can change quite a lot about this. There's a great deal of flexibility in this editing, which we'll come to later on. But that's the basis of this. And then we can add in extra modules. So let's decide we want to have something else as well. So let's say we want to have a pitch shifter in there. So again, I'll just double click that. Now with this, we've got 2 possibilities. We've got formant or detune. And again, we'll get into that a bit more later on, but just to get you an idea of how we're going. Obviously that's quite a crazy thing to have done, but you know, it's +7 and -12 semitones, but you can see it's working in a pretty extreme way. We'll get into the details of the modulation section in a later part of this video, but that's the general idea of this. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to run through a few of the presets which I've found which I think work nicely, and we'll just run through those so you can just have a listen, probably with very little or no commentary, but you can see a few that I picked out, some for this Rhodes track and also some for drums, because some of them are particularly tailored for that, although caveat, of course, you can use them for anything. So just as a reminder in this section, this is the Rhodes keyboard part which we're going to be using for all of these until we change over to drums. So for this next section of presets, this is on a drum loop. So I'll just quickly play you the drum loop that's going to be used. So you get the idea of that. Now, here's some of the more drum suitable presets, although again, you can use anything on anything if it sounds good. So let's take a look in a bit more detail at the editing possibilities of the modulation, because really that's what we're here for, because all of these effects they're all fine, but they're all fairly sort of workmanlike effects. It's your ability to modulate them that makes this interesting, and most of that is going to be happening up here for most people in this area. So let's just take a look at that in a bit more detail. And we're going to start out by loading a pitch shifter, because that's going to be probably really audible, I think. So whenever I do a demo of this kind of thing, I want to make something where it's clear what's happening and you don't have to sit there, you know, in a darkened room with headphones on and nobody talking within a 30-foot radius of you. So let's make something really obvious. So the pitch shifter should be really obvious and we can see the modulation effect. So this editor here, we can edit the modulation, and there's really a fair bit to do, because handily they've made it so we've got a fair range of time. So while this represents 100% of the selected time interval, you can see at the moment it's set to a bar. So if I just cycle round the keyboard part, you can see that each bar, this is cycling throughout that whole range. So let's just set up something fairly simple. So I'm just going to put on this square wave by double clicking it, so you can use these presets, and we'll come to those fairly quickly. So here we can see we've got 2 beats up, 2 beats down. Now if we change this time interval here, because it's set to beat, so here it's 2, so there you can see it's 2 bars. And we can set it to 4 bars, so then it will be even slower. So we'll have 2 bars up, 2 bars down, and so on. You get the idea. And what's nice with this is it actually goes up to 30-second dotted. So we can get some pretty out there results with this kind of thing. So this is nice. Now you don't have to have it synchronized to beats. You can have it in time. That will work for some people, and particularly if you want to go for some, I'm not going to say weird, but some unusual value that doesn't maybe fit in beats, then you can do that. But I think for most people, you're probably going to be using that just for beats, etc. Now, editing the actual pattern, let's put this to something slightly less frenetic, because it moving across the screen like that's probably going to get a bit annoying. Now, there are these points here which you can drag about, as you can see. So once you've got any preset, etc., loaded, you can do that. But also you can see, much like the automation curves, which were introduced quite a while ago in Cubase, we've got the ability to add curves to these. So if you've got something which needs to smoothly transition, you can do that by adjusting these points, and you can mostly get what you want. You can't get all the way off the screen, so I can't make this go even more steep. So I would need to do that with a different means. If you double click on the line, you create a new point, and as with many drawing packages, etc., it tends to inherit what was the curvature of the previous thing. So there's a bit of playing around to do, and you can see here there's the odd anomaly when things like that happen, but generally it works pretty much as you'd expect. Handily, we've got undo and redo on this. So this applies for this section only. So we can see I can undo through some of these settings which I've done, etc., which is quite nice, because not all effects offer that. And this is probably the area you're going to be working in the most. We can also shift the curve. So if we want to shift the curve over, you can see it's moving over. So you can load one of these and then offset it, etc., or draw something and then offset it, etc., which is quite useful. You can also, as it shows, flip vertically and flip horizontally there, so that's pretty handy. You can select all those points in there, and if we want to delete them, we can do. We can just reset the curve, or we can create a random curve as well. So we've got the magic dice. I'm not sure is that a legal dice? I'm not sure. Anyway, it's not got the 2 drawn right. Right, so there's our random curve. We don't get control of how random it is, which I think is a bit of a pity. We could do with like slightly random to full on nut job random, but there we go. So we've got quite a lot we can do here. Now we can also duplicate that curve. So this basically doubles it, halves the time of it, and then copies it again. So once you've drawn one, if you want to change the time of it, etc., you can do it like that, and so on. Notice that the pitch shifter has two different curves. So at the moment we're editing detune. If we click on formant, it will change to that. So we've got those totally separate targets there for modulation. So as I said earlier on, some of them come with one or two, some of them come with more than that. So you can play around with those to your heart's content. So with this here as well, what you can do is if you select an area here, let's say we select this area, then the editing controls you do here will apply only to that area. So we can flip those vertically or horizontally. So not all these do. So unfortunately, you can't shift this within the curve because you see the curve, the whole thing moves when you do that. But you can flip, etc., those and move them around once you've got them selected, etc. But not all the controls work that way. Another thing that you can't do, as far as I'm aware, is copy this curve to a different module. So for instance, when you right click and copy, this is copy the entire FX Modulator setting. So this will just effectively copy the whole thing and then paste it in elsewhere if you need to. But it doesn't allow you to copy this part of the curve and then copy it somewhere else, which is a little bit of a limitation. I think it would have been nice to be able to do that. So as I mentioned earlier on, there are banks up here. So we've got the factory bank, which has got a useful selection, but we've also got some banks here where you can put your user curves to if you want. So just by clicking the plus here, I've copied this curve, which I've created, to here. And you could obviously build up a bank, but also there are some loadable and savable banks. So if we click load here, we've got at the moment 3 different ones. So let's just load up LFO evolving, and you can see we get those, and they've got some usefully modulated modulations as well. So, you know, getting bigger, getting smaller, etc., changing frequency and so on. Pump ones, let's load those up, and waveform. So this is the kind of thing, because we've got 3, you'd probably want to just load them up in there, and then you'd be able to just demonstrate these quickly. So I won't run through all those, but they are, as you'd expect them to be, they're reasonably sensibly programmed and will save you a lot of donkey work. So often you can see there's these useful progressions between things, which saves you having to draw them all in. So just have a look at those and make use of them to save you a lot of time. One of the things which is nice to this, and kind of reminds me of Glitch, although it's not really in exactly the same league, is the fact we've got multiple effects. So it's useful to build up multiple effects. That's pretty easy to do. So we can just click add module, and let's say we want to add a bit of width after that, and then after that we're going to put on a bit crusher, etc., and then we can start playing around. And as I mentioned earlier on, you get different destinations for the modulation curve, and in many cases, you know, some useful ones. So for instance, sample division is really useful. And obviously you don't have to have the same time base for each of your effects. So for instance, on the mix here, we've got it on 1/1, and sample division, we can change that. So that changes over, let's say, 16 bars. So you can see on mix, we're changing every bar. On sample division, we're changing every 16 bars. So that would allow that to be much more interesting than otherwise would be the case. So obviously you'll be able to experiment with that and have a lot of fun with it. I could do an hour-long video running through all the modules. I don't think that's necessarily worthwhile, but you can see the range that are available, and say they're all fairly workmanlike and perfectly adequate, if not stunning effects. There's nothing particularly, you know, exciting about any of them, but obviously it's the combination of them and the way that you modulate them is the interesting thing. So triggering these effects, so there are different ways that you can control these effects. So obviously what we've seen so far, the effect is just running all the time, which can be nice enough, but you probably want more control than that. And there are 2 options for control. So the first one we're going to look at is MIDI triggering of these effects. So here you can see we've got the trigger section visible on screen, and I'm going to turn on MIDI. And you can see we've got two different modes, hold or one cycle. We'll get into those in a minute, but the setup for this is reasonably straightforward. So the eagle-eyed amongst you may have spotted that I have a MIDI trigger track set here. And all I'm going to do is send this to the appropriate thing. So in fact, I'm just going to rename this track just Rhodes to make it a little easier to see. So the MIDI trigger, we can send it to whichever slot it is. Now I've got multiple FX modulators set up on this track already, but you can see the one that we're using is on slot 2. So I'm just going to click that there and then make sure it's sent to Rhodes insert 2, which is an FX modulator. So now this MIDI is being sent to there all the time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn monitor on. So even if I haven't got that track highlighted, this MIDI is still going to be sent to the FX modulator. So now we're in MIDI mode and I've put that on. If I play the track, you can hear that the crazy pitch shift I set up earlier on, which I'm going to smooth out a bit, isn't working. But now I've pressed a note on the keyboard, it starts working. So I've still got the key pressed down. As soon as I release, it goes back to normal. Press the key and release. And with smoothing on, we get that nicer effect. If I turn the smoothing off, it's just going to jump. I've released, etc. So that's hold mode. Now, one cycle mode works slightly differently, and it will hold that for one cycle. It's slightly weird. I'm not sure why hold is on. I think hold should be called momentary, because as soon as you let go, it stops it, whereas this will do it for the entire cycle once you've played the note, okay? So I'll demonstrate that. So we'll play this back, and at the moment it's turned off because nothing's been played on the keyboard. And what I'm going to do is just momentarily tap the key and release it. So I'm going to press the key and I've released it, so I'm not holding it down, and you can see it's still going around that cycle. As soon as we get to the end of the cycle though, it goes back. So this stops you having to be super precise with your MIDI triggering of the key, because you can just press it at any point and then it will do it for the rest of that cycle, which is a bit like the way that real-time sequences, you know, things like Ableton work, where they don't change the sample until the next time round, whatever the cycle is. So that works quite nicely. It's fairly straightforward once you've set the MIDI up. So the other way of triggering this is using sidechain triggering. Now, I've changed the effect that I'm going to use here because the pitch shift one doesn't make much sense. So I've changed it to Bit Crusher, because then you'll hear this progression that's available here. So the Bit Crusher has been set up in a fairly standard manner. It's just setting it to 8 bits really. So you're clearly going to hear that effect. And in the trigger section, I'm going to turn on sidechaining. So this is working in internal mode. So it's going to be triggered by the sample itself. We'll look at triggering it from an external sample in a second. By playing around with the levels here, you'll hear the louder parts of this Rhodes thing will become bit crushed and the quieter bits will become less bit crushed. So you can hear that those hits, and we get this useful graph here, so we can see the trigger level. If we turn this up, you can see that's setting that off fully. It's a slightly weird sound, and we can use the release to smooth it out. If I turn it down, we can hear that it's actually triggering on every cycle, etc. So that's not so useful on this particular one, but what I think is useful is being able to trigger it externally. So that's what we're going to look at next. So here we have the setup for this. So here we have our sidechain trigger track. Now, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this down so we don't hear it as loud. And we're going to use a pre-fader set. So I'm going to turn this down, but we've just got this drum track here, so you can hear we can hear that it's a hip hop one from Media Bay that has been changed to the wrong tempo, but it's got clear dynamics in it, which is the reason I picked it. So hopefully this will make the triggering side of things clearer. So let's have a look at this now. So in the sidechain section, we can change it from being internal input to any of the sidechains. It makes sense to use number 1 because we're in slot number 1, but you can see you've got 6. So you could send 6 different sidechains in. And then we're going to set this up here in the normal way. So we're setting input 1, and we're going to add a source. We're going to add our sidechain trigger, and I'm going to make it pre-fader. So then we're getting all the signals. So even if we turn it down on the track, we will still get the effect of it. No pun intended. And then turning it on here. So now we will be getting the drum track, and you will see the dynamics of the drums, even though we're listening to the Rhodes. So let's just de-bypass that, and there you can hear the effect. So we're getting that effect on there, the bit crushing effect on the Rhodes, even though it's the drums that are playing. And to really highlight that, I can turn this all the way down. Because I'm using it as a pre-fader send, I can turn this fader down and we'll still get the effect. So obviously with a slightly more creative use of that, you could hint at a drum rhythm, etc. happening, even though you're not hearing it. And then when you bring that in later on in your arrangement, it will make sense to the listener because they've heard that rhythm before, etc. So being able to sidechain these effects is really useful. So that was a fairly basic use of it, but by using this across multiple effects and in more musical and potentially worthwhile manners, you'll be able to get all sorts of interesting effects which will make things tie together and make the production seem much more coherent and interesting, and have lots of interesting development happening in terms of the production, as well as hopefully the music. Some effects offer a filter bank, which means you can filter and affect only a certain range of frequencies, which can be quite useful. So here we've got a pitch shifter, which I'm just going to set globally to -12. So it's just going to be all the way down, and you can hear it's just shifting that electric piano all the way down. Now, we can turn on the filter bank and then adjust this so it's only going to be working, let's say, on the low end. So as I play it, we'll bring this down so it's not affecting. So you can hear it's working in this area, but the top end isn't being affected. And if I change the pitch that it's changing, you know, obviously if you want to go crazy, you can do it a semitone. But you can get some different effects compared to when it's not filtered. It's just changing everything, whereas here we're getting some unusual harmony, but obviously you'd probably just, you know, do an octave, etc. But it can be pretty useful for allowing you, again, to just create a more creative effect just than I've pitch shifted this and there's nothing else happening. So it's like a frequency selective mix control, effectively. So, FX Modulator, what do I think? Well, I think it's most of the way there. I quite like a lot about it. It's got a lot of flexibility. Most of the features work pretty well. As I said previously, the effects are workmanlike. They're not amazing, but they don't necessarily need to be in this kind of effect. The modulation generally works pretty well, and the sine chaining and MIDI control options add an extra dimension. For me, I think the editing of the modulation curves isn't quite there yet. There could be more features in terms of controlling randomness and being able to select and modify more features, etc. So maybe like a version 2 which had better editing would be a better plugin. But obviously, if you've got Cubase, you'll have this and you'll just be able to use it. So it's not a plugin that you're going to be buying as such. It's bundled with it. But it's definitely something that I think is going to find its way into some of my productions because it simplifies a workflow that otherwise is pretty complicated. And with some of the presets which are included, I'll be loading them up and then modifying them rather than having to start from complete scratch just using discrete effects. So as ever, I hope you found this video useful. And if you have, please like, subscribe, comment, etc. And we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.